Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, and this time we'll be covering the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 4, verse 3, the priests in the tabernacle are to start their ministry at age 30, just like when Christ started his ministry at age 30. I just think it's a cool parallel. In chapter 7, verse 1, it's interesting to me that the tabernacle had to be anointed and sanctified after it was set up and before it was used. This is a very straightforward parallel to modern-day temples and their dedications. I just think it's cool that even the things that help us go through the physical process of making covenants with and following God's commandments are materials made from the fallen world. There's nothing intrinsically special about them, but it's the time, efforts, and dedication of following God's commands and setting things apart, making them sacred, that make them holy and make the temple and tabernacle a special place. In chapter 9, verses 15 through 18, there's the cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And to me, that does indicate the presence of the Lord. And the children of Israel follow that wherever it goes in the wilderness. And I can't help see the similarities to our mortality in this detail. When we're in mortality, we're wandering through a wilderness, trying to be taught by the Lord and be worthy to enter into the promised land, aka his presence. And we do need to do that through keeping a continual eye on the Lord and following wherever he leads us. Only then can we truly become the Lord's people and be led to that promised land. In fact, I think it's interesting that though Egypt wasn't really a paradise, a Garden of Eden sort of thing, the Israelites talk fondly about being provided for and complain about being lost in the lone and dreary wilderness, much like Adam and Eve being cast out from the garden. And Adam and Eve were commanded to offer sacrifices, much like the children of Israel, and to raise their children to know and follow God. In chapter 14, verses 2 through 4, sometimes it's hard to imagine that the council of heaven, there were those that would side with Lucifer in the plan where they couldn't really choose anything for themselves, that they would rather live under the most extreme top-down control just so they wouldn't have to make a hard decision and couldn't fail. Yet here, the children of Israel call for just that. They would rather be enslaved in Egypt than to trust in the Lord. It just makes me wonder how often I feel it would be better to submit to the captivity of unchristlike thoughts and actions rather than follow the Lord in doing the hard thing of changing and facing my fears in order to enter the proverbial promised land. In chapter 15, verses 38 through 40, from what I understand, the garment in question in these verses was a square. It had 4 corners and a tassel on each corner. These borders, or edges and tassels, would be visible from any direction and were to remind the children of Israel of the covenants they made in order to stay true to the commandments of God. And they were covered, as it were, by the covenants and commandments, and the clothing tends to be a shield from the elements, and so it would protect the body. So yeah, temple cool themes are just so cool, and it goes back to the 4 corners of the earth, that it's all encompassing. Your covenants are all encompassing of you, and it would just be convenient if there were similar sort of 4 with themes and temple related clothing. In chapter 16, verses 2 through 3, this rebellion of Korath and others seems again very reminiscent of Lucifer and the war in heaven. Moses is the type of Christ. Korath is the high-ranking Levite who's convinced some of his brethren that the prophet and type of Christ takes too much on himself, that he hoards too much of the glory. He's convinced that all men are holy and the Lord shouldn't put Moses, aka Christ, above them to rule and serve as an arbiter and advocate between the children of Israel and the Lord. To resolve this, the Lord swallows up the rebel priests into the earth and burns them away with fire. Come to think of it, it's stories like these that might have started the tradition of hell being a place beneath the earth of fire and brimstone. Anyway, even here in the Old Testament, there are those who would overthrow the organization God has put in place to put themselves on top and to make themselves akin to God. Just interesting parallels to the plan of salvation. In chapter 21, verses 6 through 9, it's interesting that the children of Israel asked Moses to ask God to take away the serpents, but instead the Lord gave a way for the people to be healed in spite of their afflictions. This seems very reminiscent of both Christ's atonement, being raised up on a pole for the salvation of his people, as well as the temple ordinances, where the simple act communicates the spiritual intent and faith of the individual. The simple act of looking, in this case, was the faith to follow God's commandments. Much like with the children of Israel following the cloud or pillar of fire to literally follow the Lord, they look to the symbol as something that can and did save them from their infirmities and from sin. In chapter 22, verses 15 through 19, as far as I can tell from what scholars can tell, it seemed as if this holy man actually did receive revelation from God, even though he wasn't part of the children of Israel, and he's tempted by the wicked rulers around him that you can buy anything, including the Lord's favor, with money and fame. I think it's interesting that this holy man's efforts to re-ask the Lord the same questions and getting different answers mimics things like Jonah and Joseph Smith when they keep saying, "Hey Lord, I know you gave me an answer, but could I get a different answer?" Anyway, just interesting how they all kind of resolve the same way. In chapter 27, verses 18 through 20, ordination is by the laying on of hands before the high priest and all the congregation. This seems like an obvious way of showing that you're passing God's authority from Moses to Joshua. And it was probably done in or in front of the tabernacle. And the Lord tells the children of Israel to follow the commands to go in or come out to follow the prophet. And it's just so cool how closely the station of the prophet and the authority of the priesthood is tied to the laying on of hands, tied to the ordinances. And in chapter 31, verses 21 through 24, this is after the conquest of the promised land began, and after a set of battles, Moses commands that the only things to be kept have to go through a purification of water and fire. Anything else that makes it through that can be kept. Everything else needs to be discarded. This speaks to me the importance of only prioritizing and keeping those things in your life that are related to and that can abide with you in your covenant keeping, specifically the covenants of baptism and the receiving the gift of the Holy Ghost, and to make sure that you're always ready to be purified and stay clean because of your covenants. So that was the book of Numbers, and I'll see you next time.